Hello and welcome to this Research in Progress webinar on the right to accessible housing, identifying needs and building the right supply. My name is Sarah Lewis and I'm the Communications Manager at the Balanced Supply of Housing, a research node with a focus on addressing the need for the right supply of housing in Canada's urban centres of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. We are housed at UBC's Peter Allard School of Law, led by Dr. Alexandra Flynn, and jointly funded by SSHRC and CMHC. Before we get started, I'd also like to introduce James Markin and Tanya Adler from CHS Interpreting and Translation Service, who will be providing ASL interpretation for us today. And a quick note that this session is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. We are hosting today's webinar from the stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations in so-called Vancouver. Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by housing inequity as a direct result of colonial violence. And so we encourage you to consider where you live and work and how the land, stewarded by Indigenous folks longer than written history, plays an important role in your life. On behalf of BSH, I am pleased to welcome you to today's Research in Progress webinar on the right to accessible housing, identifying needs and building the right supply. We're excited to take a deeper dive into the recent research on the extent to which housing meets the accessibility needs of Canadians and what kind of policy reform is needed to ensure that accessibility considerations are a key piece of the National Housing Strategy's progressive realization on the right to housing. More information on this research can be found on our website under the Accessible Housing Needs in Canada project, which is being led by Dr. Nathaniel Lauster, Professor of Sociology at the University of British Columbia. Before we get into it, let me go over a few housekeeping items. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, as we'll dedicate time at the end of the webinar for discussion with our presenters. You can also use the Q&A section if you have any technical issues, and we'll reach out directly to support you. To read along, you can enable live captioning by clicking the CC option below. You also have the option to translate captions into another language of your choice. And lastly, please use the interpretation function in the menu bar to connect directly with our ASL interpreters. With that, let me introduce our speakers today. Brad Evoy is the Executive Director of Disability Justice Network of Ontario. He's a member of the Halabu Mi'kmaq First Nation, and his experiences as a disabled person have helped ground him in community and the interlocking fight for justice. Brad represents DJNO at the Fair Rent Ontario Coalition and is co-chair of the Accessible Housing Network. Dr. Alina McKay is the research manager at UBC's Balanced Supply of Housing. In her role, she works to strengthen collaborative research projects between academic and nonprofit researchers. And Dr. Colin Phillips is a housing policy expert and educator focused on solutions to homelessness. He teaches social work at UBC and Toronto Metropolitan University, holds a PhD in policy studies, and advocates for advancing the right to housing, harm reduction, and drug policy reform. Brad, over to you.
Hello, folks, and welcome. I'm really happy to be here with you today and really appreciate the opportunity to do my part of this presentation here. My name is Brad Evoy, as I already mentioned. I'm the Executive Director of Disability Justice Network of Ontario, a steering committee member for the Accessible Housing Network, and a member of the Halabu Mi'kmaq Nation. I want to first begin by acknowledging the territories that I'm sitting on today, which are the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territories of many nations, including the Chippewa, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, while continuing to be home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from across these territories. When we're thinking about housing overall, I think we need to center ourselves in the fact that there are many parts of the colonial project that intersect with housing, be it the colonial dispossession that many of our nations have faced through the actions of the wider state, whether it's the insufficient and inaccessible housing that many of our peoples have within our territories, or if we think about the broader impacts of environmental racism and violence that have been enacted on our peoples by both the state and industry. I in particular want to think about the Grassy Narrows First Nation and the struggle of Grassy Narrows and nations surrounding Grassy Narrows with the mercury poisoning that occurred and still is occurring in the English and Wabigoon River system, which is a mass disabling effect on the whole territory and all of the nations within it. And when we think about that, I think we also need to think about the continued resource exploitation that is being proposed along these same territories by the federal government, by the provincial government, and by mining and other industries. The impacts of colonialism when it comes to housing are fundamentally intertwined with these ongoing colonial sources of disablement. Ultimately, no home is accessible on these territories until true environmental racism has been tackled systemically across these territories so that people can have true, fully accessible homes that are free from these deep disabling impacts. Now, as folks from the Accessible Housing Network like to remind folks, and as I'm often told, we're only temporarily able, all of us. Sooner or later, every one of us will need our housing to be accessible. That's why we focus on universal design as a path forward for everyone. And ultimately, though, I would say that even with this in mind, even if this wasn't true, even if this wasn't the case, ultimately, we still would need to move forward with full universal design for everyone, having real accessible housing that's affordable, that can be used by everyone. Now, what is the Accessible Housing Network? Ultimately, our mission is to ensure that whatever our age or ability, every person in Canada is able to live in housing that's fully accessible. And that's why, like mentioned, we focus on universal design, changing all building codes so that everyone, regardless of what province or territory they live in, regardless of if their housing is in some way intersecting with the federal building code, that no matter what, we have the ability to live in our homes and in a good way. We are a collaboration of nonprofit organizations that advocate in support of people of all ages having that right and having that fully expressed in our system. Over 70 organizations, and I'm honored to be one of our co-chairs at this time. Now, what is universal design? Universal design is defined by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as the design of products, environments, programs, and services to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. Now, this is not to say that specialized design or adaptation isn't also part of the kind of design things that we think about, but also to ensure that there's a base, clear standard that includes everyone, from folks who experience environmental sensitivities, folks who are deaf, folks who experience other ways of being through disability. Now, ultimately, we have 7 principles that we consider with universal design that focus on equitable use, flexibility, the intuitiveness of use, making sure that information is perceptible all through these broader design processes, ensuring that folks can access their homes without hazard or accident or unintended effects, that they have low physical effort, and that the size and space fit our approaches and uses for those spaces, which is very important for all of us. Now, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Human Rights Act, the Ontario Human Rights Code, and the UN Convention all prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability. Yet, for example, in Ontario, there's no law that requires that housing be accessible, and ultimately it's the same in other provinces. And in Ontario, accessibility legislation like the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act doesn't even mention housing. There's no regulation, there's nothing at all to protect you. In fact, the built environment regulations that come along with that actually exempt housing from being part of it. Meanwhile, again, to use a provincial example in Ontario, only 15% of new apartments need to be visitable, not actually accessible enough to live there. Now, both in 2002 and 2020, the Ontario Human Rights Commission have made submissions to Ontario's Minister of Housing pointing out that the Human Rights Code takes precedence over other laws, including the Building Code. And this is true in every province. Now, no Ontario government, nor other provincial government, has taken action to bring the Building Code into harmony with our human rights codes. Now, that is the case over and over again, something that we run into all the time. Ultimately, Ontarians with disabilities, as the Ontario Human Rights Commission rightly acknowledges, routinely face discriminatory screening practices by landlords and blanket refusals to retrofit accessible features when accommodation needs arise. And further, it's incredibly difficult for us to have to move through legal processes like tribunals to get landlords to simply remove barriers and build safer environments throughout. Now, ultimately, there's been many calls to have the provincial governments across the country take action on this, but also for cities as well. In the case of Ontario, that request was also made from the Human Rights Commission that requested that obligations were under the code to build towards universal design. And in a more recent case, the City of Toronto actually took a huge step, pushed by AHN and many of our partner members, that community recommendations around accessibility be implemented that were above guidelines set by the CMHC. And that has now been integrated into the city's affordable housing guidelines, or will be soon. But we've got a little bit more to talk about there, which we'll address in a little bit. But what I want to make clear is that ultimately we run into a lot of problems overall. Provincial and federal building codes aren't strong enough. Federal and provincial accessibility legislation doesn't integrate well with these codes and is barely enforceable. And ultimately, provincial human rights codes are weakly enforced at appeals bodies and tribunals, like in the Ontario case, the Landlord and Tenant Tribunal. We also have to talk about pandemic-era measures at tribunals and appeal spaces, where a lot of things have moved online. And, ultimately, if you're looking at things like here, like a Zoom, there are a lot of accessibility features and issues that arise, and ultimately causes us to have issues talking about crossing the digital divide. Ultimately, issues of use like Zoom and other kinds of tools are those that, are fundamentally tied in with our economic circumstances, as well as other factors. So I think that if we're looking at things like, broader tribunals, appeals, we need to have multiple ways for folks to engage with them, for them to truly be accessible. Similarly, no legislation guides us in plain language about how our rights intersect with the rules or design around design or tenancy very well. Now, AHN advocates on all levels of government, federal, provincial, and municipal. But before we get into exactly what we do, let's talk a little bit about the different areas of government and related legislation. So, on the national level, we have to look at things like the National Building Code, as well as related legislation like the National Housing Strategy and the National Housing Act, as well as bodies of the government like the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Now, from 1945 to 1996, there's been lots of investment and involvement in housing from the federal government, so from the Second World War up to Jean Chrétien. Now, in 1996, there were a number of cuts to social and wider housing building, a lot of cuts to co-ops, a lot of overall undermining of that social fabric. And similarly, that's mirrored provincially in all senses. There are provincial legislation that impacts housing, like the Residential Tenancies Act, as well as tribunal systems like those of the Landlord-Tenant Board as well as the Ontario Building Code. And we also have to consider things like social assistance, the housing supports that are available there, though they're only available if you are housed. If you are unhoused, you lose access to those supports. And there's been many recent pieces of legislation, some of which we'll get into later. But, similarly, in around 1996, we see Mike Harris on the provincial level in Ontario. And in that case, Mike Harris was well known for his cuts to many of our social safety net pieces. And, we have to also take that in mind across the country as well, where at the same time, many provinces were engaging in similar neoliberal activity. Now, municipalities are often engaged in funding intersecting services like transit, planning, zoning, and also in many cases run public social housing. In some cases, provinces do that though. Now, as well, some could be expected, like in the case of Ontario, to run accessibility standards. But as you'll see, there are some issues with that as well. Additionally, bylaws on rent evictions and heat have been a new thing that has been pushed in many cases and in many municipalities to great success by tenant advocates, disabled folks, and many of our community members. In particular, the Toronto Green Standard has really set a high mark on sustainability in housing, which is a really strong vision of what that could look like provincially and nationally. Now, ultimately, on the municipal level, things are bylaws, and bylaw enforcement is, no matter what city you're in, notoriously weak. And ultimately, cities are the creation of the province that they're in, so they have a lot more limits in what they can do without the approval of the provincial government. Let's consider that a bit of foreshadowing. Now, in practice, each level of government likes to tell us at the Accessible Housing Network to talk to someone else on these issues. The federal government thinks everyone else should do anything else before they amend the building code. Cities and housing providers aren't required to build above the code. And the province says they won't amend the code provincially before the federal government does. We like to call this the talk to the other guy cycle. No matter what, there's always somebody else to talk to, and someone else whose concern our issues should be. Now, what's really interesting is that there is a national standards body for building codes, where they create a national model code along with other construction codes and things like that. But the cycle for those codes are about 5 years. Now, the 2030 cycle is just beginning this year. And if you think about it, it's going to take 5 years for that new model code to come into effect. So 5 years before any government will do anything. But also it takes additional time once they've produced these model codes to actually produce codes that will move into effect within a particular province or other jurisdiction. So once again, things lag behind. It could be 5 years, it could be 7 years, it could be 10 years before change is actually enacted through this highly technocratic process, when we know through our community's lived experience that we need action now. Now, I want to just take a second to talk about the Ontario Accessible Design Guidelines a little more. We mentioned it earlier. Now, we had a lot of success at AHN with this. This is an issue that was brought forward through AHN and the Accessible Housing Working Group there in Toronto. And former city councillor Kristen Wong-Tam, who's now an NPP, was very instrumental in bringing that forward. They were able to make standards, as mentioned, above recommendations from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And City Council, in the end, approved those recommendations, which is great. However, while we had success in passing those guidelines, they weren't perfect. They really don't have enough in place to look at environmental sensitivities. You'd think after a world-spanning pandemic, where the large focus was on HVAC systems and ensuring that there's overall air quality in spaces, that more steps would have been taken overall to ensure that that's part of the conversation. So something that we definitely want to further follow up on in future. Further, there could be further input from deaf communities, particularly around the need for visual fire alarms and things of that nature. But, you know, an initial step is good. It gives us the ability to build and create more guidelines in future. Yet, city staff that supported the guidelines have now left the city or moved into another position. And then, Bill 17 was passed. This bill is intended by the provincial government to fast track the building of homes. But we have to ask, the building of homes for who? The bill undermines local requirements on housing accessibility. We are no longer able to build above the building code. It's no longer required. So, sure, the city can choose to do that for their own buildings, but they can't incentivize in a meaningful, permanent way the ability of folks to do that. So if you're in the private sector or the for-profit sector or the nonprofit sector. Additionally, what's really concerning is that this also impacts everything from the rent evictions bylaws we spoke about earlier to sustainability in housing. And further on that point, it also undercuts the development charges that fund cities in our province. Now, what's even more concerning is that, part of our work as the Accessible Housing Network is to challenge institutionalization. That we want to ensure that people can live and age and thrive in our communities. But this bill actively incentivizes the building of for-profit long-term care institutions through, again, exempting those institutions specifically through a lack of development charges. So, in the end, we are put in a very difficult position where we can't build better, they can build worse faster, and there's even more long-term care jails being built all across this province. Turning to British Columbia, we also need to look similarly at British Columbia's Mental Health Act, which actively is being challenged by the Council of Canadians with Disabilities through a wider court challenge. Now, this bill already gives the government and the broader state a lot of power to hold people and institutionalize people in different ways. But what's even more concerning is that they've used this bill while this court challenge has been ongoing to enact violence on unhoused communities and drug users. And so, we look at that kind of model as something that many, broader provinces are looking at and considering moving towards. We've seen similar in Ontario with Bill 6 that actively works to criminalize unhoused folks as well. So ultimately, what we see is a broader push towards institutionalization and criminalization of unhoused communities. And as we know, unhoused communities are disabled communities. And we need to be able to defend those communities and ensure that folks can move into actually affordable, accessible housing. Now, with that in mind, we have to remember that, accessible housing is more than just design. It also has to ensure that we can afford to live in our communities, that we can afford to be part of our communities. Now, in 2022, fewer than 14,500 people were on either of Ontario's main social assistance program that were experiencing homelessness. And in 2024, about 2 times as many were unhoused. And we also know that folks on WSIB, CPP disability, and old age security are all struggling similarly. It is a huge number of our communities who are, impacted by a loss of just simply affordable housing. And the reality is that we don't know those full numbers and their full extent. Moreover, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, there is a very clear impact on the intersection of social assistance and housing when, in Ontario, for example, if you are unhoused, you no longer get access to housing benefit funds, ensuring that people who are unhoused stay unhoused. And, the Human Rights Commission and the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate noted in June 2024 that the temporary income supports that were made during the COVID-19 pandemic had made a notable difference in helping make housing more affordable. In 2022, the rate of renters with disabilities who lived in unaffordable housing, had dropped from 45% to 35%. That's 10% in just a couple of years, from 2022 to 2026. But now, post the end of those supports, is rising once again. Moreover, the Commission and the Advocate also noted that disabled people are 4 times more likely to experience homelessness, that we're more likely to become unhoused due to violence, that we're more likely to live in unaffordable housing, and twice as likely to live in core housing need. That's housing that's unaffordable, not in good repair, or with not enough space, which, as you can understand from looking at accessible housing, is incredibly important. And that ultimately, our homes don't have the physical aids that we need. It's so serious that many in our community, as the Advocate and Commission note, are turning to medical assistance and dying, something that is supported also by the Ontario Coroner's Office for their own independent review. And that's simply because people don't have the supports and services that we need to live with dignity. And, if that's the kind of situation that we find ourselves in, I think we fundamentally need to take a look at the kind of priorities that we're bringing forward as a wider society. But if we want to talk about dignity, let's talk about what will allow us to thrive in community. And so, if we look here, this is the Toronto numbers done in a great study by the Wellesley Institute about thriving in Toronto as a single working-aged adult. Now, for folks without a disability to thrive in this city, they say you need about $61,654 a year. And that covers your housing, transportation, healthcare, personal care, and what have you. But for folks with disabilities, that's about $10,000 to $20,000 more. And as you can see, that intersects very clearly with a number of areas, but most particularly pieces that are related to housing, like personal care. The need for home care funding to go alongside housing funding. These are not 2 separate areas of consideration. These are deeply and fundamentally interlinked. Now, for many folks here looking at these statistics, you might say, well, that's Toronto. Of course it's expensive. Toronto's expensive. But I want you to look at this next slide, which is thriving in Mississauga, which is much more expensive and about $20,000 to $30,000 more. And if you look closely here again, it's pieces that are intersecting with housing that are the most overall expensive. If we look at transportation costs, where some of the broader infrastructure might not be like the TTC in Toronto, or if you look at, again, personal care, which is $2,000 more and change expensive, as well as overall healthcare costs. These pieces are not separate from housing, and the choice of where we live is not separate from how much things will cost. Ultimately, for us to be able to live in community, we need not just, to double social assistance or to increase those values, but to bring values up to a level such that we can thrive in our communities in the places in which we live. So then actually affordable housing then means we need a lot of things. We need clear baseline legislation that enshrines our basic rights and is modifiable through direct community power. We need clear methods of inclusive accommodation that goes beyond the baseline and isn't held up through landlord or governmental neglect. We need clear and accessible access to funding to receive just care in our homes, in our communities, without being forced out. We need clear ways to appeal decisions and access justice. And ultimately, we need actually affordable housing with meaningful rent control and housing that's owned by co-ops, communities, and not corporations. Meaning we have a lot of work to do, friends. But we need, right now, desperately, to be able to take the collected and concerted concerns of tenants, condo residents, and members to collected and concerted resources that will help us on our legal supports around disability and accessibility accommodations. We also need to include disability and accessibility in legal challenges on recent legislation, like in Ontario around Bill 17 or Bill 6 and many more, but also in other provinces too, like folks are already doing around the Mental Health Act. Now, before we close, I want to highlight a few resources. First, I want to note the Federal Housing Advocate, which receives submissions from the public on systemic housing issues and unmet housing needs across Canada. Now, what's really fantastic about the Advocate is they also have the power to bring forward direction to the National Housing Council. And, just before I finalized these slides, the Advocate actually put forward a request to the National Housing Council to develop a review panel on accessible housing, which is a huge victory for Accessible Housing Network and many advocates all across the country who've been calling for this. So this is going to give us the opportunity to bring forward wider issues to the government on a whole host of levels. And we're really excited to see that come forward. Speaking of such panels, there is also an ongoing review panel called NEHA, which focuses on the right to safe, adequate, and affordable housing for women, two-spirit, trans, and gender-diverse people, and the government's duty to uphold those rights. Now, there's two upcoming sessions that I wanted to highlight for folks. One on June 20th for safe, permanent housing for survivors of gender-based violence that our friends here at the UBC Balanced Supply of Housing group is working on. And then on June 23rd, one focused on the safe, adequate, and accessible housing needed to meet the diverse needs of all disabled peoples. And a number of groups, including AHN, DJNO, and others, will all be part of that as well. Finally, friends, I wanted to highlight three resources. The Cooperative Care Alliance, which focuses on providing the opportunity to build workers' cooperatives that focus on providing care. These care worker cooperatives really pull resources away from for-profit institutions and toward something that can truly build just care between care receivers and care workers, and ensuring that care workers are not exploited in that process, which is a critical part of our own liberation. Similarly, we have the Towards Just Care project, a project that DJNO is quite heavily involved in, that's focused around looking at models of home care. Because as we've mentioned, that is fundamentally interlinked with our broader look towards care. We cannot have truly accessible homes unless we can receive truly just care in those homes and in those spaces as we need it, so that we can continue to live and thrive in our communities. Further, I know I've mentioned environmental sensitivities several times through this presentation, and I would strongly encourage folks to check out the Environmental Sensitivities Coalition of Canada. They have a bunch of great resources on environmental sensitivities that would be really helpful for folks to check out. Again, friends, thank you so much for the opportunity to bring this presentation forward to you all, and I really look forward to your questions and discussion. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and I'll pass it to Alina.
My name's Alina McKay, and I'm the research manager for the Balanced Supply of Housing. I'm so glad to be here today and present after Brad, who did such a wonderful job of setting the stage of the need for accessible housing across Canada. With that, I'll jump into my presentation. So this research really came about after some conversations with the Accessible Housing Network. So I'm going to start by sharing that background, then I'll share some of the key themes that we looked at in our research, the development of the question bank, the workshops where we received feedback on that question bank, and then some of how we incorporated that feedback, what we learned, and then next steps for the project as well. So, just in terms of the background, in the spring of 2023, Kate Chung at the Accessible Housing Network reached out with us to meet, and so glad to see Kate here on the call today. So, she shared with us that people with disabilities were terrified of losing their housing, even if it didn't meet their needs. And so Accessible Housing Network had also made a submission in 2002, so over 20 years ago now, to the Ontario Human Rights Commission asking for building codes to meet accessible needs. And she had, followed up on that, and the Chief Commissioner, Patty McGuire, had really confirmed that no changes had been made during that time to make housing more accessible. So in 2019, as many of you know, the National Housing Strategy Act was signed into law, making the progressive realization of the right to housing something that Canada was required to work towards. And people with disabilities were identified as a priority population that action needed to address their housing needs. So there are over 8 million Canadians that have disabilities across Canada, according to the Canadian Survey on Disabilities, and that's the 2022 survey. And there was also reports of widespread rights violations of persons with disabilities. So when we set out to do this research, we decided to focus on two urban areas. So specifically, we decided to focus on Toronto and Vancouver, which are, urban centers, English speaking in Ontario and British Columbia. So different like policy regimes and governments. And then Dr. Colin Phillips, who was also working on the project, had some community connections in the University of at Waterloo. So we also decided to expand the study to include that community. And in terms of eligibility, we focused on people living in Toronto, and also like that were 19 years and older. And we're living, sorry, Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver. And show some current slides. Hello, my name is Alina McKay. Hello, my name is Alina McKay, and I'm the research manager for the Balanced Supply of Housing. So at the Balanced Supply of Housing, as Sarah's Thank you, Brad, for that wonderful introduction. Hello and welcome. My name is Alina McKay, and I'm the research manager for the Balanced Supply of Housing. So today, Hello and welcome. My name is Alina McKay, and I'm the research manager for UBC Allard School of Law's Balanced Supply of Housing. Today, I want to talk to you about our project on the right to accessible housing, where we've been working with persons with disabilities to develop a survey looking at the right to accessible housing. And this work is in partnership with Dr. Colin Phillips. So just an overview of my presentation today. I'll be starting with providing some background information about the project, as well as key themes, the question bank in terms of what the focus was on and how we developed those questions, the workshops where we received feedback on our question process, and then what we learned and our next steps. So in the spring of 2023, Kate Chung from the Accessible Housing Network reached out to meet. And this was really because she'd seen our newsletter and was, enjoyed reading it and seeing what we were up to in terms of looking at housing supply in Canada and needing more balance and who was represented, but really felt that people with accessibility needs were missing from the work that we were doing to date. And she shared with us in one of our first meetings that Dr. Colin Phillips and I had with her that people were terrified of losing their housing, even if it didn't meet their needs. And also, just to some background, the Accessible Housing Network in 2002 had shared with the Ontario Human Rights Commission that there was a need for building codes to meet accessibility needs. And when Kate and the Accessible Housing Network had followed up with Chief Commissioner Patricia McGuire almost 20 years later, there hadn't been any substantive action taken. So they really felt like there was a real need for change. As many of you know, in 2019, the National Right to Housing Strategy Act had been signed into law, and this really opened the door for people with disabilities. They were identified as a priority population, and there was a need for the government to act on the progressive realization of their right to housing. And so, across Canada, there are over 8 million Canadians that have a disability. And this is according to the Canadian Survey on Disabilities in 2022 findings. And there's also reports of widespread rights violations of persons with disabilities in terms of their right to housing not being realized. And this is really the background environment that we set out to study this issue in. So when we looked at eligibility, we really wanted to focus on Canadian urban centers, which is where the Balanced Supply of Housing does research. And specifically, BSH focuses on Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. And we felt that the situation in Quebec was different enough that it made sense to focus on Ontario and BC for this study. So our eligibility included people living in those two cities, and then we also expanded to the community of Waterloo because my co-researcher, Dr. Colin Phillips, had connections to that community. So we thought that it would be a good place to expand our research. We also were interested in working with people that had disabilities or people that were assisting a person with a disabilities in terms of who the study was actually, seeking to get feedback from. And then people needed to be 19 years or older. So we set out to look at some key themes and around the right to adequate housing, and these really fell into three groups. So when Dr. Colin Phillips and I had attended the Balanced Supply of Housing Spring Workshop back in 2023, or maybe it was 2024 now, Dr. Michelle Voles had spoken about, there being three broad areas that housing rights fall into. And that's really people's ability to access housing, right? Their ability to find housing that meets their needs. What are are they experiencing discrimination when they're applying to housing? Are they able to find housing that meets their needs? Those kind of issues right around actually accessing it. There's also occupancy rights that really have to do with living in housing, right? What are people's experiences when it comes to being able to paint the walls the color that they like, or add a bar or a railing when they need it, things like that, or adjusting the counter heights. Those are all things around actually living in a unit and how you might change it to meet your needs. And then there were these final set of rights around being able to exit in a dignified way. So moving from housing, what were people's experiences, accessing resources that they needed, and getting, also around forced moves and evictions as well. So we also were interested in looking at this issue, drawing on the United Nations right to adequate housing framework. And this is really, from the Special Rapporteur's work on the right to adequate housing, which includes things like security of tenure, which is guaranteed legal protections against forced evictions, harassments, and other threats, availability of supports and services. So this includes things like safe drinking water, adequate sanitation, heating and cooling, which is incredibly important, right? Especially given the very variable conditions that Canadian climate can throw at us. Affordability. So this is around the costs of that might threaten occupancy. And in Canada, we're really looking to that affordability measure of 30% of before tax income, no more than that, should go towards housing costs. Habitability, around the physical and safety protection and safety that housing should provide. Accessibility, of course, which is around meeting specific needs of disadvantaged and marginalized groups. Location, which is really focused on having the opportunities for employment, healthcare services, schools, childcare, and social facilities that are located, nearby, and also that the area that housing is not polluted or in a dangerous area. And then finally, interested in cultural adequacy. So being able to express cultural identity that might be in, having a shared interest group, or also practicing a religion, things like that might be part of cultural adequacy of housing. So we started looking at these issues and created a question bank. And again, the question bank started with these access rights. So we looked at the literature and identified questions that really focused on things like the accessibility needs and challenges of finding housing that met those needs. Waitlist for social affordable housing is a big part of it, especially accessing affordable housing, right, which is a key challenge for many people with disabilities. Discrimination during the application process, and also what advocacy and supports were available for navigating, finding housing. We then looked to questions around occupancy rights. So these included accessibility of current housing, the housing costs and subsidies. So, how much was housing actually costing people? Choice in location, neighborhood and community satisfaction, which is really around, like, do people feel part of their community? Are they able to, access community amenities? The maintenance and repair of the home. So is it in good condition? Can people make changes that they need to? And then just day-to-day experiences of discrimination that people might experience in their housing. Finally, we looked at exit rights and questions around those. So that might include even the ability to move, right? Some folks with disabilities had really expressed that the ability to move can be quite hampered because there's only so much accessible housing. And also, if a new job comes up, it's not always easy to find housing that meets your needs. So that autonomy and ability to move can be challenged. There's also forced moves around eviction, so people experiencing feeling pushed out or being forced to move. Landlord-tenant relationships, of course, mediating that, and then also access to advocacy and supports when navigating leaving housing. So once we had developed the question bank, we held 3 workshops. Each of the workshops focused on a specific range of questions. So, those 3 groups of questions, and they were held in January and February of 2025. We had 16 unique individual participants, and 7 participants participated in all 3 workshops. And each of the workshops, we also had ASL interpretation that was provided to help make those workshops accessible as well. What we heard back from workshop participants was that there were really different experiences for different types of housing, right? So homeowners really spoke to the challenges that people with disabilities face when they are looking to buy a home, whether it's finding a appropriate real estate agent or someone that, having accessible information around the accessibility of the unit, that was challenging information to find, and not everyone was sort of equipped to help navigate that. Um, that's also around the adaptability of emergency and communication systems. So, did the home have a system that could actually be adapted, say, with a visual fire alarm rather than an audible one? There were also a lack, like as I mentioned before, a lack of information about accessibility of units on most listings. And then once people moved into their house, especially if it was, say, like a condo unit, strata meeting minutes and information wasn't always accessible. And those were challenges that were unique to homeowners. The workshop also identified that renters had unique challenges. So, specifically around securing affordable rental housing, that, housing wasn't accessible, even if it had all the accessibility features, if it didn't actually meet affordable challenges. So, it was also challenging to navigate the landlord and tenant relations. So, tenants, especially if uh, they were a person with a disability, really expressed that they often had to educate landlords around what the landlord's rights and responsibilities were, especially with, say, an emergency system. And the landlords, they had a responsibility to make sure that, say, a deaf person had a visual fire alarm. Things like that came up where there was an added burden of having a person with a disability having to sort of advocate for their rights. There were also unclear processes for requesting modifications to improve the accessibility of the unit. So this might include like reducing environmental irritants. So, upgrading a HVAC system or something like that to reduce irritants. It was often unclear who was responsible for the costs associated with that. And then also generally there was also experiences of feeling pushed out, so accessibility needs being a burden that landlords, just wouldn't respond to in some cases, that left tenants very vulnerable. In co-op housing, there were also a different set of experiences. So, the co-op housing people that were living in co-op housing really expressed that their co-ops were often very responsive to their accessibility needs. So it was a very different experience again from our folks living in rental or housing or that own their own home. There was a discussion of just needing to have those conversations and do that education work again around considering accessibility. So co-ops in some cases had shared tasks. So maybe that was, shoveling your walkway in front of your house or contributing to the garden. And in some cases, folks with disabilities weren't able to, for example, shovel a pathway in front of their household. So there was needed for those conversations around whose responsibility it was. There was also, again, the need for cooperative meetings to be accessible and those board processes also to have some accessibility considerations. Then in social affordable housing, we really heard from people that there were long wait lists and a lack of transparency in the process, that making modifications to their units was often challenging, and not always available, especially on a fixed income. And then also there was challenges to navigating older designs. So, many of those 1970 buildings that are social affordable housing have lots of different stairs and levels and things like that. And for, say, like a mother with a disability that has a child on the second floor, it might not be available to go and walk up those stairs, or that unit might not be accessible. So those were considerations that weren't always taken into account when placing a household. So our next stage was really taking all of this feedback that we had received from the workshops and applying it to the survey. So based on the feedback we received, we split the survey into 4 different groups based on these different experiences. So a specific survey for owners, renters, people living in subsidized housing, and people living in co-op housing. And then we also had additional feedback that had more to do with like the question wording, also adding definitions or clarifying information, and then providing opportunities for short answer options because people really wanted to be able to explain, what was happening, if there was a specific issue that they could, click a multiple choice. Yes, this is occurring. And then, why is it occurring or what's happening in the background? People wanted the ability to add that information as well. We did learn some lessons throughout this process. So, in terms of recruiting the people that are participating in our workshops, we had really wonderful participants that added so much to the survey and were so important to strengthening the survey and research. And screening was essential. So, we did find that many people that expressed interest, we had over 100 people express interest in participating in the workshops, but many of them, you know, didn't necessarily, when it came to down to it, might not have had accessibility issues and were, wanting to participate for maybe reasons that were a little unclear to us. Eli, friend who's here, they were so helpful. They were our research assistant for this project. They were so helpful in helping identify some of the folks to flag that, had said, yes, I have a disability, and yes, I live in the region you're interested in. But when it really came to asking them about what was where they live, right, it would be like, oh, actually, I live in Montreal, or weren't always being completely clear. So asking for video was important. Having access to ASL interpretation for those early conversations was also important. And then, our recruitment, just a technical note, we had that link online and probably should have provided that on link to our website so it could be taken down easily. Um, in terms of the workshops, we also learned that we had prepared slides with the information on the slides, but really found that having information in the chat and then talking through it, so both a visual and like audible record of what the question was, as well as the different options, that was the best way of having information for workshop participants. And then we also had ASL interpretation on those workshops. So there was really three ways that people could engage. So through the ASL interpreter, through the written, they could read through the question, or we would also talk to the question, and that was helpful for the people to then be able to respond in the chat, respond in ASL, or respond, orally. So we also found that we had originally set it up as a Zoom webinar, and we just needed to keep it as a meeting so people could pin interpreters and interact fully with the Zoom interface. Terms of next steps, really, what do we want to accomplish with this survey? Well, it really goes back to what Kate told us right back in 2023, that people were terrified of losing their housing, even if it doesn't meet their needs. There is a need to address this issue. And so our survey is really collecting information on these experiences with that focus on access, occupancy, and exit, and bringing these experiences together in a way that we hope will shift policy. So, and support recommendations for advocacy that is needed with a focus on the right to housing. And there are positive changes that we've even seen since starting this research. So accessible ready housing standards were adopted, and make it so that housing is more easily adapted for new housing that will be built. But there's still a need for deeply affordable accessible units that just, in many cases aren't available. So we'd like to see the accessible housing standards actually adopted for nonprofit housing in many cases. And next step, so what can you do if you are a person with a disability that's living in Waterloo, Toronto, or Vancouver, and you are 19 years of age or older, please, use the QR code or follow up and fill out the survey. It's also online at bsh.ubc.ca. And with that, I will turn it over to questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much once again to Brad, Colin, and Alina for sharing this important research today. If you'd like to revisit this Research in Progress webinar, you'll be able to find the recording on our website in the coming days. And we encourage you to reach out to us or any of our researchers if you have further questions. To learn more about our research, including today's topic, visit our website at bsh.ubc.ca and stay up to date with all things balanced supply of housing by signing up for our newsletter or following us on social media, links to which you can find in the chat. We also encourage you to follow Accessible Housing Network and subscribe to their newsletter on their website at accessiblehousing.network.org. Thank you once again for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time.